The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer above room 347, and Megan O'Brien's hands moved through their practiced ritual, blood pressure cuff, temperature, pulse oximeter, with the precision of someone who'd learned to function in sandstorms and darkness. 8 months at Seattle General in Savannah had taught her that hospitals and war zones weren't that different. Both places demanded silence. Both places required you to move fast and think faster. Both places would kill you if you hesitated. Colonel William Chen's vitals were stable. BP 118/74. Heart rate 62. O2 sat 98% on room air. She'd been monitoring him for 6 weeks, ever since he'd arrived with a cardiac arrhythmia that the cardiology team said would probably resolve on its own. What they didn't know was that Chen commanded the Special Forces unit that included Megan's son, David. What they didn't know was that every single conversation Chen had with his wife, every phone call to his daughter, every request for more pillows or a different type of juice, all of it was intelligence. All of it mattered. That was the reason she'd accepted this placement, taken a nursing job she didn't need, and spent the last 8 months in a hospital where the walls felt like they were closing in. She pressed her left forearm against the bed rail for just a moment, feeling the scar tissue there, jagged, thick, a reminder of the Hindu Kush, and then let go. The scar had healed 3 years ago. Everything had healed by now. Some things just never stopped reminding you they were there. "Your 4 is running clear," Megan said quietly to Chen, her voice pitched low enough that only he could hear. She wore her composure like armor. 8 months of practice had made it flawless. "How's the pain level?" "None," Chen said. His eyes tracked hers for half a second, long enough for him to see something he recognized but couldn't quite name. Better than the field hospital at Kandahar. She didn't respond. Couldn't respond. Not where anyone might hear. She just checked the medication line one more time, made a note in the electronic chart, and turned toward the door. That was when she heard the footsteps. Dr. Edmund Mercer entered room 347 like a man accustomed to people stepping aside, and Megan watched his eyes narrow as he took in the scene, her hand still on the 4, Chen's steady vitals on the monitor, the room that ran like clockwork. She'd been at Seattle General long enough to understand Mercer's calculus. He was a cardiac surgeon with 27 years of practice, 14 published papers, and a reputation built on the idea that nurses existed to follow his orders, not to think. Competence without credentials was something he couldn't categorize, which meant it threatened him. "Nurse O'Brien," he said. "I need to discuss your technique." The way he said it, the syllables clipped, the emphasis on your, told her everything. This wasn't a conversation. This was a declaration. She felt his gaze move across her like a targeting laser, cataloging her for some future offense. She'd felt that same look before, in the eyes of insurgents and hostile intelligence officers. The look of someone preparing to eliminate a threat. "Of course, Doctor," she said. Her voice didn't waver. Her hands didn't tremble. She turned to face him with the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. "What concerns you?" Mercer's jaw tightened. He'd been expecting defensiveness, probably. Nurses usually got defensive. They stammered. They explained themselves. They tried to justify their work. Megan did none of these things. She simply stood there, waiting, with the kind of stillness that made the air pressure in the room change. "I reviewed your charting from the past 2 shifts," Mercer said. "Your notation of the patient's cardiac rhythm is imprecise." She had charted sinus rhythm with a heart rate of 62, which was exactly what the monitor displayed. The notation was, in fact, textbook perfect. But Megan understood something essential about men like Mercer: they didn't actually care about the charting. They cared about power. They cared about making sure everyone understood that they were the smartest person in the room, that their credentials mattered more than anyone's judgment, that a nurse, no matter how competent, was fundamentally subordinate. "I can review the monitor strips again if you'd like," Megan said. She didn't offer to argue. Didn't offer to defend herself. Just offered to work. "Would you like me to pull them now?" Mercer's eyes flashed. The fact that she wasn't fighting back seemed to infuriate him more than if she'd challenged him directly. He turned to Colonel Chen without responding to her, his voice shifting into the kind of false warmth doctors used for patients, the voice of reassurance masking condescension. "You're in good hands, Colonel, though I'll be reviewing your care more closely going forward," Mercer said. Then, as an afterthought, he glanced back at Megan. "Nurse O'Brien, you'll defer all clinical decisions to the resident on duty. I want documentation of every medication administration, every vital sign check. Everything." It was a power move wrapped in procedure. It meant Mercer had already decided she was a problem. It meant the next 8 weeks were going to be a campaign. Megan had read the situation correctly in his first words. "Understood, Doctor," she said. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. She'd learned this kind of restraint in 6 months of operator selection, the ability to stay calm while everything around you suggested panic. The ability to absorb hits and keep moving. "I'll ensure complete documentation." After Mercer left, the room fell into the kind of silence that followed power struggles, heavy, expectant. Chen watched her for a moment, something shifting in his expression. Not quite recognition. Not quite suspicion. Just an awareness that whatever he'd heard in her voice was familiar. "8 months you've been working here?" he asked. Megan was already moving toward the medication cart, documenting her visit, preparing the next rounds. The fluorescent lights buzzed their electric monotone. Somewhere down the corridor, a heart monitor beeped steadily. The hospital sounds were white noise now, the rhythm of a place that never fully slept. "That's right," she said. Not offering more. Not making it a conversation. Just a simple fact. "That was Mercer, wasn't it?" Chen said. "The cardiac surgeon?" "Yes. I've been in field hospitals where the triage nurses ran things better than the attending physicians," Chen said quietly. "Sometimes the most experienced person in the room doesn't have the highest rank. Sometimes the person who stays calm under fire isn't the one with the title." She didn't respond, just made another notation on her chart, but she felt something shift in Chen's assessment of her. The recognition hadn't happened yet, it might never happen, but something had registered. She was competent. And that competence, in a place like this, where hierarchy mattered more than ability, was going to be dangerous. After she finished her rounds, Megan returned to the nurse's locker room, a grey concrete space that smelled like antiseptic and the faint ghost of old coffee. She opened her locker, number 47, 3rd row from the bottom, and there it was, folded in a triangle, no bigger than a greeting card. The flag had been folded 3 times by someone who understood ceremony, and beneath it, tucked into the crease, was a photograph of Marcus Chen, her teammate from the 75th Ranger Regiment. He'd been killed in the Hindu Kush 3 years ago, in the same valley where David was deployed now. The flag was her reminder of why she'd accepted this placement, why she was willing to endure Mercer's cruelty, why she needed to stay in this hospital and maintain her cover for as long as it took. She touched the flag once, very gently, and let her thumb trace the blue corner. Some people carried photographs. Some kept journals. Megan carried this, a folded reminder of what could be lost, of what was still at stake, of why she couldn't let men like Mercer intimidate her into breaking her cover. The pain was information. That's what her instructors used to say. Pain is data. And Mercer's arrival was data too. It told her that he'd already identified her as a threat. It told her that the next phase of his campaign was beginning. It told her that the worst part wasn't behind her, it was still coming, probably in ways she couldn't yet predict. She closed her locker, pocketed her access badge, and moved back toward the ICU. The evening shift was about to begin. There were 12 patients who needed monitoring, 8 medication rounds to complete, and a man in room 347 who'd just started to understand that the nurse monitoring his condition was far more than just a nurse. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Edmund Mercer had just decided she needed to be eliminated, and he had no idea that the woman he was about to target had survived far worse than anything his hospital career could offer. She didn't know yet that within 6 weeks, everything would change. She didn't know yet that her cover was about to become everything. She just knew that there was work to do, and that Colonel Chen's vitals weren't going to monitor themselves. The monitor in room 347 beeped steadily as she entered, sinus rhythm, strong and reliable. She made her notation. She moved to the next patient. The night continued exactly as it always did, beneath the fluorescent lights, in the hum of machines that never slept, in the careful silence of someone trained to accomplish the impossible without ever asking for recognition. The grand rounds began like they always did, 8 residents trailing behind Dr. Mercer like a school of pilot fish in his wake, their white coats pristine, their stethoscopes draped in that careful way that screamed they'd never had to use them in actual emergencies. The ICU morning light slanted through the windows, turning the machines into monuments of steel and glass. Mercer moved from bay to bay with the theatrical precision of a conductor, stopping occasionally to point at something the residents could learn from. His audience hung on every word, desperate for his approval, the same approval he dispensed like scraps. When he reached Bay 6, he pulled a chart from the bedside and held it up. "Residents, let's use this as a teaching moment." His voice carried the weight of institutional authority, a man who'd spent 3 decades collecting credentials like other men collected cars. "I want you to identify the numerous protocol violations Nurse O'Brien has committed in this chart." He said her name the way someone might say a stain they'd found on the carpet, something disappointing but unsurprising. Megan stood at the medication cart across the unit, her hand steady as she checked the 0800 orders for patients. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She'd heard this particular performance before, variations on a theme that had been repeating for the past 8 weeks. The residents shifted in their white coats, uncomfortable, glancing at each other like prey animals sensing a predator's interest. One resident, young enough to still have acne scars, pointed at the monitor strip. The heart rate documentation seems inconsistent with the medication timeline. Another tried, the fluid balance sheet is missing the overnight intake values. Mercer nodded, encouraging them deeper into error, his smile like a wolf showing its teeth. "Anything else? Look closer, people. This is sloppy work." That's when Megan looked up from the medication cart. Her eyes moved across the room, a 30-meter distance, and something in her face shifted into focus. Not anger. Focus. She set down the medication cup with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence, walked across the unit with the kind of economical movement that came from someone who'd walked across rooftops in Kandahar, and stopped 3 feet from the gathered residents. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze its mechanical rhythm. "That chart isn't mine, Doctor," she said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You're reading from Bay 6. I'm assigned to Bay 9. Mercer's face didn't flush immediately. He was too practiced for that. Instead, he looked down at the chart in his hands as though it had betrayed him personally, then back at her. His jaw tightened, a small muscular tell that suggested he was recalibrating, searching for an angle. "Your defensiveness is noted," he said finally, turning back to his residents. "This is exactly the kind of attitude problem we see with nurses who lack proper credentials. Always reaching beyond their scope, always defensive when questioned." The residents followed him to the next bay like nothing had happened. But Megan saw the young resident with the acne scars glance back at her for half a second, a look that contained something like recognition, the beginning of understanding that he'd just witnessed something important. He'd just watched someone stand accused of something false and correct the record without apology, without explanation, without the trembling voice of someone seeking approval. She'd simply stated the facts and moved on. That was what made Mercer's rage run so deep. It was the refusal to perform the expected script. 3 days later, Megan stood in front of the vending machine on the 3rd floor, feeding dollar bills into the slot. The machine hummed with mechanical hunger, digesting her money. She'd skipped lunch, as she did most days, running labs and charting while the other nurses took breaks in the break room. The solitude suited her. Less performance required. Less need to watch her voice, her posture, her face, the constant micromanagement of existing in a space where people were beginning to look through her instead of at her. The elevator doors opened near the vending machines, and 3 physicians stepped out. Dr. Mercer. 2 cardiologists she recognized from around the hospital. Their voices arrived before they did. Frankly, I wonder if nurses who can barely handle an for insertion should really be working in the ICU, Mercer was saying, his tone suggesting he was sharing a professional concern rather than executing a public execution. I've seen patients under her care, basic competencies just aren't there. It's a liability issue, really. The cardiologists made those non-committal sounds that meant they were uncomfortable but not uncomfortable enough to contradict a senior physician. Mercer's eyes found Megan at the vending machine. They locked on her like a weapon system acquiring a target. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She didn't even stop retrieving the package of almonds that had finally descended into the retrieval slot. But her hand paused for exactly 1 second, not trembling, not shaking, but holding still with the kind of intentionality that came from someone who'd been trained to never give away more information than necessary. When that second passed, she extracted the almonds, turned to face the 3 physicians, and felt the tear escape before she could contain it. Just one. Just the one. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, the movement deliberate and clean, and her eyes never left Mercer's. "My patients are stable and pain-free, doctor," she said. Her voice carried the weight of something that wasn't anger, it was something colder, something that came from a place where survival depended on accuracy. "That's more than can be said for yours." The 2 cardiologists suddenly became very interested in their pagas. Mercer's face went white, then red, then settled into a shade somewhere between them, the color of someone whose usual methods had failed to produce the expected result. He opened his mouth, closed it, then turned back toward the elevator without responding. Megan opened the almonds and ate them slowly, the salty crunch filling the space where a response should have been. The machine's hum seemed louder than before, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. What they didn't know was that Mercer had spent the last 2 weeks making phone calls. The next morning, the charge nurse Sarah, who had, 6 weeks ago, invited Megan to lunch and seemed almost like a friend, no longer made eye contact. The resident from Grand Rounds crossed to the other side of the hallway when he saw her. The nursing assistant who'd asked to shadow her for an afternoon suddenly had other assignments. Something had poisoned the space she occupied, some kind of contagion that spread through whisper and implication rather than fact. Mercer had activated his network with the precision of someone who understood institutional power the way a general understands battlefields. 3 phone calls, she'd learned later through the careful observations of listening to conversations she wasn't supposed to hear. 3 calls to colleagues at other hospitals, all variations on the same theme: medication errors, patient complaints that never appeared in the official record, behavioral concerns, scope creep. Nothing actionable. Everything damaging. She heard a resident mention it in the break room as she was leaving. Mercer says she's been reported twice this month. Something about documentation. Something about exceeding her scope. The break room went silent when they realized she'd heard them. Someone spilled a coffee cup on purpose, the sound was too convenient, too theatrical. A distraction to cover the embarrassment, though no one was comfortable enough to acknowledge it. Megan walked past them to her locker, retrieved her stethoscope, and moved to the patient rooms. The silence of being believed but not trusted was different from the silence of being disrespected. It was quieter. Longer. More complete. She had 8 hours left on her shift. She would complete them with the same precision she brought to everything, full attention on the monitors, the vital signs, the subtle changes in breathing patterns that signaled when something was wrong. She would not seek approval. She would not explain herself. She would move through the unit like someone moving through water, present but separate, her entire existence compressed into the work itself. When she reached Colonel Chen's room, she paused at his bedside. His breathing seemed slightly labored, nothing dramatic, nothing that would alarm a casual observer. But Megan had been trained to read bodies the way code breakers read encrypted messages. Each breath was information. The rise and fall of his chest held data. Respiratory rate elevated. Slightly. Nothing yet. But something to watch. Something that might become important. She touched the folded flag still hidden in her locker from 3 rooms away, a tactile reminder through distance and walls. Marcus's flag. A reminder of why she was here, why she endured the whispers and the sideways glances and the slow systematic erasure of her professional reputation. The intelligence Chen carried was worth her dignity. It was worth all of it. Across the unit, Mercer moved through his own patients with the same authoritative presence as before. But there was something different now, a tightness around his eyes, a sharpness to his movements that hadn't been there yesterday. He'd made his moves. He'd positioned his pieces. Now he was waiting to see if they would yield the result he wanted. He had no idea that results were about to become irrelevant. The monitor alarm screamed at 9:27 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of sound that meant seconds mattered. Megan was finishing her morning assessment on Colonel Chen when his breathing shifted, shallow and rapid, each exhale coming faster than the last. She'd seen this pattern before. In Kandahar. In a forward operating base where the mountain air was thin and a wounded Marine's chest cavity was filling with air that had nowhere to go. Chen's oxygen saturation dropped from 94 to 88 to 82. His trachea deviated visibly to the left, pushed by pressure building on his right side. Tension pneumothorax. Textbook. Fatal in minutes if untreated. Megan's hands moved with the precision of someone who'd done this in dust storms and firefights, not under fluorescent lights. She reached for the intercom, her voice steady as glacier ice, code team to room 347. Now. The response came in seconds, the rhythmic percussion of running feet, the squeak of the crash cart wheels racing down the corridor. But it was Mercer who arrived first, shoulder first through the doorway like he owned the room. He always arrived first to crises. It was his theater. Everyone clear, he commanded, already pulling on fresh gloves. His fingers fumbled with the chest tube kit, the plastic packaging resisting him. I'll handle this. Out. All of you. Megan didn't move. I said out, Nurse O'Brien. This is my patient now. His voice had that edge, the one he used when he was performing for witnesses, when he knew the code team was watching. When he needed them to see him save the day. Chen's oxygen hit 71. His lips were turning blue at the edges. Mercer was still struggling with the kit, his hands shaking slightly, not from fear, Megan understood, but from adrenaline and the intoxicating knowledge that he was about to be the hero. He hadn't even identified the second intercostal space yet. The needle wasn't out of the packaging. Chen had maybe 90 seconds before his heart rate crashed into the floor. Megan moved. Not toward the door. Toward the bed. Step back, doctor. The words came out in a voice nobody in the room had heard before. Not the deferential tone she'd been using for 8 months. Not the careful, measured responses she'd given him during grand rounds and vending machine humiliation. This voice was flint and steel, the kind of voice that came from someone who'd ordered men into fire and brought them home alive. She had the needle out before Mercer could process what was happening. 14 gauge. The right size. The right needle. Her fingers located the landmarks with the kind of certainty that came from doing this while dust kicked up around you and mortars fell in the distance. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. 2 fingers below the clavicle. 1 heartbeat. She positioned the needle perpendicular to the chest wall and pushed. The hiss of air escaping was like a breath the room had been holding for too long finally releasing. Chen's oxygen saturation climbed. 75, 82. 88, his color returned from cyanotic blue to pink in 30 seconds, his breathing easing from panicked gasps to something almost normal. The pressure in his chest equalized. His body relaxed back into the bed. The room went dead silent. The code team froze, their hands still positioned over the crash cart. One of the residents had a syringe halfway drawn. A nurse was standing with an oxygen mask suspended in air. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. They'd all just watched Dr. Edmund Mercer, head of ICU, stand useless while a floor nurse, a person he'd spent weeks describing as incompetent, perform an emergency procedure with the kind of casual precision that only came from having done it before. Many times. under conditions that made this hospital's controlled environment look like a simulation. Mercer's face went white first. The kind of white that comes when you realize you've been wrong about something fundamental. Then it went red. Not the pink flush of embarrassment. The deep crimson of rage. The color of someone watching his carefully constructed authority collapse in real time. Everyone out. Now. The code team dispersed like startled birds. Within 30 seconds, it was just Megan, Mercer, and Chen, whose eyes had opened and were focused and clear and alive because of what had just happened. You just ended your career. Mercer's voice was quiet now. Controlled. Almost worse than when he'd been shouting. That's practicing medicine without a license. I have 6 witnesses. I have your name. I have what you just did on that patient. Megan was already washing her hands. The antiseptic smell of the hospital-grade soap filled the small space between them, sharp and clinical. She didn't look at him. His oxygen saturation is 96. His color is pink. His breathing is normal. He's alive. You don't get to decide what constitutes an emergency procedure. Only licensed physicians. Then call the board. She turned to face him, and for the first time, their eyes met directly. Not the guarded gaze of a subordinate. The level, unflinching stare of someone with nothing left to lose. Tell them what I did. Tell them why I did it. Tell them you were fumbling with a kit while a patient was exsanguinating into his thoracic cavity. His jaw clenched. She saw it. The little muscle spasm that meant he'd understood exactly what she was saying. She'd just given the board a choice: defend her emergency intervention or defend his incompetence. Politics wasn't her specialty, but medicine was. And medicine always won. Eventually. Mercer left without another word. But within 30 minutes, Megan watched him from the medication station as he made 3 calls from the main desk. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language, his arm gesturing, his jaw rigid, his voice rising and falling in the cadence of someone who was pulling strings. By 11:15 a.m., a hospital board member arrived on the unit. By 11:41, another one. They were in the administrative conference room, the one with the mahogany table and the painting of the hospital's founder on the wall. At 12:30, the phone call started. A voice from St. Luke's Medical in Atlanta, the hospital where Megan had done her previous assignment. Yes, we have some concerns about your reference. Behavioral patterns. Scope of practice violations. Nothing concrete, but troubling. A voice from Mercy General in Tampa would prefer not to rehire. For quality assurance reasons. By 1:02 p.m., a hospital investigator appeared on the unit. Her name was Patricia Holloway. She had the kind of tired eyes that came from spending 3 decades watching powerful men destroy good people for making them look bad. She didn't seem surprised by any of it. Pack your belongings, Captain. Dr. Mercer has filed a formal complaint regarding unlicensed practice of medicine. You're suspended pending investigation. The word captain landed like a punch. Holloway had said it without emphasis, without any indication she'd noticed what she'd just called her. But Megan's instincts, the ones that had kept her alive in places where a word out of place could get you killed, registered the deliberate choice. Holloway knew something. They sat in the HR office for 42 minutes while Mercer's narrative played out like a script he'd been rehearsing. The investigator took notes. She asked follow-up questions that seemed designed to give Megan space to explain herself, but the script had already been written by someone with 3 board members and a network of allies who'd already heard the version they wanted to believe. He was fumbling with the kit, Megan said quietly. The patient's oxygen was dropping. 90 seconds is all we had. Dr. Mercer says you've been undermining his authority for months. And now this. Holloway closed her notebook. You need to leave. I'll process the paperwork. By 3:15 p.m., Megan was in the locker room, staring at the scrub she'd been issued 8 months ago. 8 months. That's how long a carefully constructed operation lasted. That's how long it took for one man with institutional power to dismantle what had taken her command months to set up. She folded them carefully. The fabric was soft from repeated washing, worn thin in places from long shifts and the constant friction of the work. She placed them in the hospital laundry bin, watching them disappear under the white sheets and pillowcases of a dozen other discarded garments. Her locker was almost empty. A spare pair of compression socks. 2 energy bars she'd never eaten. And at the bottom, in the corner where she'd placed it on her first day, the folded flag. Military colors, 6 by 4 inches, folded in the precise triangle that meant ceremony and honor. It wasn't Chen's flag. It wasn't from her current assignment. It was from Marcus. Her teammate from the Hindu Kush. The one who didn't come home. She pressed her palm against it for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough to feel the weight. Long enough to remember why she'd accepted this assignment in the first place. Colonel Chen knew things about David's unit. About the operation. About why Marcus had been in that place at that moment when the IED detonated. That intelligence was supposed to help her understand. Was supposed to give her closure. Now she had neither. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Opened them. Her hands weren't shaking. Not from fear. From something else. Something colder. When you've already lost the things that matter most, a suspended nursing license is just a setback. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that losing her position meant losing her access to Chen. No access meant no opportunity to extract the intelligence. No intelligence meant mission failure. And mission failure meant she'd be reassigned somewhere else, to someone else's case, to someone else's war, because that's what this job was, even in a clean hospital with white walls and sinus rhythm monitors. She was shouldering her bag when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Unknown area code. The kind of call that didn't show up in regular logs. The voice on the other end was crisp. Military. Captain O'Brien? This is Admiral Graves from JSOC. We need to talk about what just happened at Seattle General. Dr. Mercer's face went white. Not pale. White. The color of a man watching his entire career collapse in real time. He stood at the foot of Colonel Chen's bed, chest tube in place, oxygen saturation climbing, 88, 92, 96, while Megan stepped back from the monitor, her hands already moving to dispose of the needle. The code team froze. No one spoke. The only sound was the ventilator's steady whoosh and the heart monitor's accelerating rhythm as Chen's body woke up to breathing again. Mercer opened his mouth. Closed it. His eyes locked on the needle in her hand, then on the syringe, then on Chen's rising oxygen numbers. He understood what had just happened. His incompetence. His trembling hands with the chest tube kit. Her intervention. Her save. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like angry wasps, and in that moment, the entire ICU understood something Mercer had spent 8 months refusing to accept. This wasn't a nurse playing at medicine. This was someone who'd done this before. Many times. Under conditions that made an operating room look like a day spa. Mercer turned and walked out without a word. But Megan had been around enough powerful men losing control to recognize the silence. It wasn't acceptance. It was the sound of someone reaching for his phone. Within 58 minutes, she checked the timestamp. 3 separate calls went out to board members. The first came from the hospital administrator's secretary, who'd overheard Mercer in his office. I have a serious concern about a nurse practicing medicine without a license. I need to report this before she hurts someone. The second call went to the chief of surgery, a man with whom Mercer belonged to the same country club. The third went to the hospital's legal counsel. By 4:06 p.m., Megan's references were being contacted. Seattle General's HR director called a clinic in Fort Campbell where Megan had supposedly worked 2 years prior, a clinic that existed only on paper, maintained by Special Forces Command for exactly these situations. The call went through the proper channels. The voice on the other end gave carefully worded non-answers that somehow managed to plant every seed Mercer had sown. We have no record of disciplinary issues, but, well, there were some operational incidents we preferred not to document. Operational incidents. The phrase had teeth. It suggested something worse than incompetence. It suggested instability. By 5:15 p.m., a hospital investigator, a woman named Patricia Sobel with the expression of someone who'd seen every manipulation tactic in the book, appeared at the ICU nurse's station with a folder under her arm. "Megan O'Brien? I'm going to need you to come with me to HR. We need to discuss your actions during the code this afternoon." The walk to the administrative wing felt like walking through water. The hallway light seemed dimmer. Megan's badge clattered softly against her chest with each step. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and stale resignation. Sobel gestured to a chair across from her desk and opened the folder with the precision of someone executing a prepared attack. "3 board members called about your performance in that code," Sobel said. "Dr. Mercer reports that you performed a needle decompression, is that correct?" "Yes." "Without his authorization." He was holding the chest tube kit incorrectly. The patient's trachea was shifting. "I had 3 minutes before cardiac arrest." Sobel wrote something down. "You understand that only physicians can perform invasive procedures. Nurses can assist, but they cannot. The patient would be dead. Initiate treatment independently. That's practicing medicine without a license, which violates Tennessee state law and hospital policy." Sobel looked up. "I've also received calls about concerning behavioral patterns in your personnel file. Your previous employer mentioned operational incidents. Care to elaborate?" Megan didn't. She sat still. Hands flat on her thighs. Breathing steady. This was the moment where most people panicked, where they tried to explain, where they gave Mercer exactly what he wanted. A nurse rattled enough to say something that could be twisted further. "Effective immediately, you're suspended pending investigation," Sobel continued. "You'll surrender your badge and ID. You're not to return to the unit or contact any patients. Hospital security will escort you out. Do you understand?" Megan understood perfectly. She understood that Mercer had activated a network she couldn't counter, that his institutional power came from 30 years of belonging to the right clubs with the right people, that the truth wouldn't matter because the accusation itself was the weapon. She understood that she'd failed. She picked up her badge. Walked out of HR without another word. The locker room was empty at 6:33 p.m. Fluorescent lights flickering in that distinctly hospital way, the hum of institutions that never slept. Megan opened her locker, number 847, and pulled out her scrubs. Blue, the color of every nurse in the building. She unfolded them carefully, even though they'd just be thrown into a bin. Smoothed out the wrinkles. The fabric was soft from 100 washings, thin in places from 8 months of shifts that bled together like watercolors. She placed them in the hospital laundry bin, her hands moving mechanically. The final act of a nurse who'd never actually been one. She'd trained for 3 years at Fort Bragg for this placement, had spent weeks memorizing medication dosages and hospital protocols, had endured 8 months of Mercer's cruelty and humiliation specifically because she couldn't break cover. Couldn't reveal why she was here. Couldn't explain that her son David was missing in action somewhere in the Hindu Kush, that Colonel William Chen was his commanding officer, that intelligence about David's unit was locked somewhere in Chen's memory and she was the only person who could reach him without raising flags. Her hand trembled, just once, as she opened the bottom of her locker and touched the folded flag. The fabric was old, worn soft by time and handling. One of Marcus Webb's unit flags, the one his parents had given her after the funeral. Marcus, who died in David's arms in that mountain pass. Marcus, who'd trusted David to get him home. David, who'd come home alone. The flag was all the justification Megan had ever needed for anything. She took the bus home that night. Rain started as the doors closed behind her, a steady drumming against the windshield that sounded like 1,000 fingers tapping out a message she didn't want to receive. Mission failed. Access denied. No intelligence. No David. The next morning, she returned to Seattle General in civilian clothes, jeans and a black jacket, the uniform of someone no longer welcome. The badge they'd taken the night before had been her only key. She'd have to collect her stethoscope, her trauma shears, the personal items nurses accumulated over 8 months of 12-hour shifts. The night shift was clocking out as she arrived. Nobody met her eyes. She was pulling her stethoscope from her locker, the scope with her initials on the earpieces, training tool from Fort Bragg, one of the few personal items she could keep without raising questions, when the screaming started. Raw. Primal. Male. The kind of sound that doesn't belong in a hospital where everything is supposed to be controlled and antiseptic and professional. It came from the ICU, muffled by walls and distance but unmistakable in its violence. Where is he? Where's my uncle? Everyone in the administrative wing froze. Megan's hand stopped halfway to her bag. She recognized that rage. She'd heard it in Kandahar from men watching their homes get bombed. She'd heard it in the ICU waiting room from families being told their loved one wouldn't survive the night. She'd heard it in her own voice once, 7 years ago, when the chaplain showed up at her door. The screaming got louder. A crash, something heavy hitting something solid. Then the distinctive clang of an footpole hitting the floor hard enough to leave a dent. Someone get my uncle. Now. Megan moved toward the sound without thinking about it. Muscle memory, muscle understanding, the kind of automatic response that Special Forces training spent 3 years embedding into your nervous system. Threats moved toward you because that's what threats did. You assessed them. You controlled them. You got close enough to understand what you were dealing with. The ICU was chaos. Staff had scattered like startled birds. A nurse, Chen's regular day nurse, Sandra, was halfway through the medication room door, using it as cover. The security guard stationed at the unit entrance had backed into the corner near the supply cabinet, hand hovering near his radio but making no move to engage. Smart. He understood the physics of the situation. A man 6'8", somewhere north of 300 pounds, with rage making him strong as reinforced concrete, was not a problem you solved with a radio call. SWAT was 45 minutes out, and in 45 minutes there would be bodies. The giant was holding an 4-pole like a club now, the metal shaft catching the fluorescent light as he swung it in a wide arc that suggested he didn't care what it hit. His face was purple with fury, jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscles working beneath his skin. His eyes were wild, unfocused, not seeing the room so much as seeing something else, something that terrified him enough to make him this dangerous. Megan walked toward him. Not quickly. Not slowly. Just walked, the way you'd approach a spooked animal, the way you'd move through a minefield. Her hands were visible. Empty. No sudden movements. No threats. I'm Captain O'Brien, she said. Her voice had dropped an octave. The nurse voice was gone, burned away the moment she'd performed that needle decompression. This was something else. Something with authority built on survival, on being the last person standing in situations where everyone else died. Your uncle is stable. I need you to let me take you to him. The giant's breathing was ragged. His eyes focused on her for the first time. He was looking for a target, looking for someone to destroy because his uncle was somewhere in this building and everyone around him was moving like prey, and prey meant the threat wasn't contained, wasn't controlled, wasn't something that would let him rest. Then he saw her face. Or maybe he saw her stance. Maybe it was the way she stood without fear, without backing away, without any of the signals that told his lizard brain he was winning. Maybe it was just the sound of her voice, steady as a surgeon's hand, calm as someone who'd talked down armed insurgents in Kandahar using only words and presence and the kind of certainty that came from having nothing left to lose. He lowered the 4-pole. Just slightly. Just enough that it was no longer a weapon. Just enough that his hand started shaking, and Megan recognized that shake, it wasn't weakness, it was the moment after, the moment when adrenaline realized the threat was past and your body remembered that you'd been terrified. Come on, Megan said, and reached out. Her hand didn't touch him yet. Just offered. Just waited. The giant followed her toward room 347, this massive man with combat-grade PTSD, following a woman in jeans and a black jacket like she'd just given him an order he couldn't refuse. The ICU opened up in front of them. Staff still pressed against walls. Security still frozen. But no one moved to stop them. Colonel William Chen's eyes were open when they entered. The old man took one look at his nephew, then looked past him directly at Megan, and his entire face changed. Recognition. Understanding. Something that looked like relief mixed with the weight of 100 compromises and secrets and hard decisions made in the dark. "Reaper," he whispered. The giant froze at the sound of her voice. Not because she was loud, she wasn't. Because she was calm. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "Your uncle is stable," Megan said, her hands visible and steady at her sides. "I'm Captain O'Brien. I need you to let me take you to him." The nephew's shoulders heaved. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, pupils blown wide, the 1,000-yard stare of someone whose brain had been rewired by IEDs and ambush fire and the weight of brothers' bodies. His fist unclenched. A chair clattered across the tile floor behind him, forgotten. Staff pressed themselves against walls, not breathing, not moving. But Megan stepped forward, closing the distance between them like she was walking through rain that didn't dare touch her. "David," she said quietly. Only his first name. Not military protocol. Not hospital procedure. Just a name, the way someone says it when they understand that rank and credentials mean nothing when a man is drowning in his own nervous system. His breathing began to slow. Megan guided him down the corridor, one hand near his elbow, not touching, just present. Her stride was fluid, deliberate, the gait of someone who had walked through insurgent checkpoints and Taliban strongholds and lived. They reached room 347. Colonel William Chen lay propped at a 45-degree angle, oxygen tubing at his nose, monitors displaying the steady rhythm of a man who would live because of a captain in scrubs who understood that sometimes saving a life meant ignoring everything you were told to do. Chen's eyes opened. Recognition flooded across his weathered face. He whispered a single word, "Reaper." The room tightened. Not physically. But the air itself seemed to acknowledge something. David's breathing stabilized completely. He moved to the bedside chair and sat down like someone had finally given him permission to stop fighting gravity. That was when the Marine stepped forward. He stood in the doorway of the ICU, not young, maybe 45, decorated combat jacket, the kind of presence that made you understand that every title and credential you'd ever earned meant nothing compared to a man who'd been trained to make impossible decisions in zero visibility conditions. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He pulled out his phone and began reading, each word landing like a hammer strike. Captain Megan O'Brien. Call sign Reaper. Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. 12 years active duty. 3 combat tours. Hindu Kush Theatre, 2014 through 2016. Bronze Star with Valor for extraordinary heroism under fire. 2 Purple Hearts. Security clearance level TS-TSCI. He paused. Looked directly at Megan. "Welcome back, Captain." Footsteps erupted from the stairwell. Fast. Angry. Dr. Edmund Mercer burst through the ICU doors, face flushed the color of a man who'd spent the last 6 hours making phone calls that weren't being answered the way he expected. His mouth opened to speak about protocols and chain of command and the insubordination of a nurse who'd crossed every professional line. A 2-star general stepped through the same door. Pentagon security moved behind him like sharks sensing blood in the water. The general's uniform was weighted with ribbons, the kind of service record that didn't just earn you authority, it earned you the ability to reshape how authority was understood. His eyes found Mercer the way a thermal camera finds heat. "Dr. Mercer," the general said quietly. "Your hospital director is in the administrative conference room right now reviewing security footage from Colonel Chen's emergency decompression. Captain O'Brien is here on a classified military intelligence operation. She has been cleared for displacement at the highest levels. You have been interfering with a federal asset. That interference ends now." Mercer's mouth moved without sound. His face turned the color of old concrete. He looked at Megan once, really looked at her, and something in his expression cracked. Not sympathy. Just the dawning realization that everything he thought he understood about the quiet woman he'd spent 8 months tormenting had been wrong. That he'd spent 243 days trying to break someone who'd already survived things that would have shattered him completely. Mercer turned and walked out. The general didn't watch him go. Instead, he nodded at the Marine, who stepped aside. 2 Pentagon security officers moved down the corridor in Mercer's direction, not aggressively, just present. Making sure. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Edmund Mercer. The worst part came 3 hours later when he received the call from the hospital IT director, a man named Rodriguez who'd spent 22 years in the Navy before transitioning to medical technology. Rodriguez had been monitoring hospital security footage since the moment the Pentagon security team arrived. He'd noticed everything, the way Mercer accessed Chen's room footage at 10:44 p.m., exactly 17 minutes after the general walked through the door. The way Mercer's hands shook as he located the recording from the code. The moment, 2:19 a.m., when he clicked delete. What Mercer didn't know was that Rodriguez had been watching for 3 weeks. The moment Mercer's cursor hovered over those files, an encrypted backup had been created on a drive that lived in a secured safe in the hospital IT director's home office. Every frame of Mercer's frozen incompetence. Every second of his fumbling hesitation while a patient turned blue. Every moment of Megan's calm precision saving a life that his paralysis would have lost. Rodriguez walked directly to the hospital administrator's office at 2:23 a.m. Didn't call. Walked. Carrying a laptop and a USB drive and the weight of a man who understood that some things required you to act immediately, without permission, without protocol. "Sir," Rodriguez said, setting the drive on the desk. Dr. Mercer just attempted to delete federal evidence. Security footage from Chen's emergency code. "I have everything." His inability to perform the procedure. His active interference with Captain O'Brien's life-saving intervention. The timestamp showing he accessed the system 17 minutes after the Pentagon security team arrived. The administrator watched 30 seconds of footage. Just 30 seconds. His face hardened like concrete in a foundry. Convene an emergency board meeting. Tonight. By 11:38 p.m., Dr. Edmund Mercer received his termination notice. Effective immediately. Grounds: gross negligence, interference with federal operations, destruction of medical records, abuse of institutional authority. Security escorted him from the building with his personal belongings in a cardboard box. The same security officer he'd threatened Megan with 6 months earlier held the door. 6 months after that termination, Megan stood in her full dress uniform outside Seattle General in Savannah. The afternoon sun caught her Bronze Star and the new decoration pin below it, a Defense Intelligence Agency Commendation Medal for her 8-month classified operation, the intelligence that had led to her son David's extraction from a Taliban detention facility along with 3 other prisoners of war. Colonel William Chen stood beside her in dress blues, the weight of intelligence he'd carried finally released, finally safe. The hospital's board of directors unveiled a shadow box on the main corridor wall. Inside, the folded flag that had once sat hidden in her locker. The memorial to Marcus. The reminder of why she'd endured 8 months of humiliation in silence. The plaque beneath it read, "In honor of Captain Megan O'Brien, call sign Reaper, who served in silence." Charge nurse Sarah was there, having apologized to Megan 3 times in the past week. Rodriguez was there, wearing a Navy veteran pin on his hospital badge. The Marine Guard was there. David stood beside his mother, uniform pressed, eyes clear, alive because his mother had walked toward danger while everyone else ran. During the applause, Megan's eyes caught movement near the loading dock. A medical supply van. Driver's window open. Through it, she could see Dr. Edmund Mercer in a company polo shirt, delivering gauze and syringes for a temp agency that paid $14 an hour. He was watching the ceremony. Watching the shadow box. Watching a captain in dress uniform receiving recognition for 8 months he'd spent trying to destroy her. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. Megan didn't smile. Didn't acknowledge him. Didn't move. She just looked through him the way you look through a window at weather passing, significant enough to notice, not significant enough to engage with. Then she turned back to Chen, who was speaking into a microphone, his voice steady and ceremonial. Captain O'Brien reminded me, Chen said, that the most powerful thing a warrior can do is serve without recognition, endure without complaint, and save lives whether anyone knows your name or not. David leaned close to his mother and whispered, he would have died if you'd listened to Mercer. I would have died still locked up. Megan touched the shadow box. Marcus's flag. 8 months of measured breaths and measured responses and measured endurance. A giant who everyone else ran from while she walked forward. A choice made in the dark that the light finally revealed. She said quietly, barely audible over the applause, the ones who have seen the worst often give the most. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, or if you've ever had to endure in silence for something larger than yourself, we'd love to hear from you. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about the quiet heroes who change everything. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and let us know in the comments, what would you have done in Megan's position? Would you have walked toward the threat? We read every single comment, and your stories matter.